Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be section A of part 2 from chapter 3, William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience. Again, this is section A, James's definition of religion and the scope of his inquiry. James is well aware of the difficulty associated with trying to offer a definition of religion, and he only settles on his own definition after acknowledging and emphasizing the difficulty of the exercise. Accordingly, he writes, quote, "Most books on the philosophy of religion try to begin with a precise definition of what its essence consists of, yet the word religion cannot stand for any single principle or essence, but is rather a collective name." End quote. Footnote 485 cites the source. Having said this, he continues, quote, "Yet this need not prevent me from taking my own narrow view of what religion shall consist in for the purposes of these lectures. This, in fact, is what I must do." End quote. Footnote 486 cites the source. And so, in his empirical, pragmatic, and psychological approach to religious experience, James defines religion as, quote, "the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine." End quote. Footnote 487 cites the source. He then elaborates on this basic definition, refining it for his purposes throughout much of the first half of Varieties. He acknowledges that, quote, "controversy comes up over the word divine," end quote. Footnote 488 cites the source, and he seeks to further clarify what he means by the term as a result. Not surprisingly, this discussion quickly turns to the notion of God, as traditionally conceived, i.e. as a being possessing supernatural qualities, and whether belief in such a God is a necessary ingredient in religion. James suggests that belief in God is not a necessary component of religious experience. Indeed, on his account, Buddhism and Transcendentalism both qualify as religions, despite the fact that neither of them entails belief in God. Because, quote, "the sort of appeal that Emersonian optimism on the one hand, and Buddhistic pessimism on the other, make to the individual, and the sort of response which he makes to them in his life are in fact indistinguishable from, and in many respects identical with, the best Christian appeals and response." End quote. Footnote 489 cites the source. James argues that we have good reason to call them religious. After characterizing Transcendentalism and quoting Emerson, James writes, quote, "It would be too absurd to say that the inner experiences that underlie such expressions of faith as this and impel the writer to their utterance are quite unworthy to be called religious experiences." End quote. Footnote 490 cites the source. Ultimately, he concludes that from his experiential point of view, he must, quote, "call these godless or quasi-godless creeds religions," end quote, and, quote, "interpret the term divine very broadly as denoting any object that is godlike, whether it be a concrete deity or not," end quote. Footnote 491 cites the source. I should note that, although he includes belief systems some might not be so inclined to call religious, James is not alone in thinking of religion so broadly. Recall, for instance, my earlier discussion of J.S. Mill's similar conception of religion. Footnote 492. See part 1 of chapter 1. End of footnote 492. There are some important implications associated with James's broad view of religion that I think warrant attention here. Proudfoot raises some valid concerns about James's broad conception of religion, suggesting that, quote, "as is, it allows us to call a madman's delusion of having kissed the Virgin Mary his religion," end quote. Footnote 493 cites the source. Proudfoot further speculates that one whose, quote, "relation to the divine is one of skepticism," end quote, might, on James's definition, also be construed as religious. Footnote 494 cites the source. Moreover, while many, and perhaps most, would associate religion with belief in a supernatural God, James clearly does not limit himself to cases where this belief is present. Therefore, he does not require what is, at least for many who cannot contemplate the nature of religion, an essential ingredient of it. However, while there may be a general tendency to associate religion with a belief in a supernatural God, James points out that many nonetheless do associate atheistic belief systems, such as those mentioned above, with religion. He suggests that, quote, "there are systems of thought which the world usually calls religious, and yet which do not positively assume a God. Buddhism is in this case," end quote. Footnote 495 cites the source. Ultimately, since James does not confine himself to an analysis of phenomena where belief in a supernatural God is present, we ought to be on guard against conflating what he says regarding religion's utility with assessments of religion's utility incorporating narrower and exclusively supernatural conceptions of God, for example, Nietzsche's. To do so would obviously be a mistake. In section B of part 3, the significance of James's conception of religion is amplified by my juxtaposition of his notion of religion with Nietzsche's. Naturally, one of the chief byproducts of James's broad conception of religion is that the term comes to denote a wide range of experiences. Indeed, the diverse nature of religious experience is a central theme throughout Varieties, as James clearly makes it a point to emphasize this aspect of religion. When beginning to define religion, for example, he says, quote, "Let us rather admit freely at the outset that we may very likely find no one essence, but many characters which may alternately be equally important in religion." End quote. Footnote 496 cites the source. Later he suggests, quote, "The whole outcome of these lectures will, I imagine, be the emphasizing to your mind of the enormous diversities which the spiritual lives of different men exhibit. Their wants, their susceptibilities, and their capacities all vary and must be classed under different heads. The result is that we have really different types of religious experience." End quote. Footnote 497 cites the source. In fact, despite the extraordinary breadth of James's own survey of religious experience and Varieties, this wide-ranging nature of religion compels him to stress that, quote, "The field of religion being as wide as this, it is manifestly impossible that I should pretend to cover it." End quote. Footnote 498 cites the source. As a result, James readily admits that he cannot possibly hope to offer an adequate analysis of all aspects of religion, and the extremely diverse nature of the subject requires him to focus on a more clearly defined portion of it. To this end, James tries to better define the scope of his own inquiry by articulating what he does not intend to discuss, i.e., to quote, "say what aspects of the subject we leave out," end quote. Footnote 499 cites the source. It is at this point that James offers his well-known distinction between individual religious experiences and organized religion. Specifically, he speaks of, quote, "one great partition which divides the religious field," end quote, where, quote, "on the one side of it lies institutional, on the other personal religion," end quote. Footnote 500 cites the source. He associates theology and ecclesiasticism with institutional religion, and reserves the designation of personal religion for the original and personal religious experiences of individuals, which have less to do with outside influences, such as the traditions of a church. He describes institutional religion as a kind of externally oriented experience, suggesting that, quote, were we to limit our view to it, we should have to define religion as an external art, the art of winning the favor of gods," end quote. Footnote 501 cites the source. Personal religion, on the other hand, entails the opposite and reflects a kind of internally oriented experience. Here it is, quote, "the inner dispositions of man himself which form the center of interest," end quote. Footnote 502 cites the source. Having distinguished individual religion from institutional religion, James then narrows the scope of his inquiry by opting to focus solely on individual religion. Quote, "I propose to ignore," he says, "the institutional branch entirely, to confine myself as far as I can to personal religion pure and simple." End quote. Footnote 503 cites the source. In a similar vein, he asserts, quote, "the immediate personal experiences will amply fill our time, and we shall hardly consider theology or ecclesiasticism at all." End quote. Footnote 504 cites the source. What's more, when evaluating the fruits of saintliness, which he takes to refer to, quote, "the right fruits of religion and character," end quote. Footnote 505 cites the source, and which I shall return to in section A of part 3, James reminds his readers that, quote, "in critically judging the value of religious phenomena, it is very important to insist on the distinction between religion as an individual personal function and religion as an institutional, corporate, or tribal product," end quote, and that, quote, "the religious experience which we are studying is that which lives itself out within the private breast," end quote. Footnote 506 cites the source. Note that this emphasis on individual religious experiences is in his basic definition of religion, according to which he chooses to focus on, quote, "the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude," end quote. Aside from needing to narrow the scope of his inquiry in order to make his task more manageable, James makes it clear that he has additional reasons for leaving out the institutional elements of religion from his purview. For one, he argues that many of the ill effects commonly associated with religion are the result of its institutional elements, and he suggests that these negative effects can make it difficult for some people to glean the advantages associated with more private religious experiences. On this point, he reflects that, quote, "when we hear the word religion nowadays, we think inevitably of some church or other, and to some persons the word church suggests so much hypocrisy and tyranny and meanness and tenacity of superstition that in a whole undiscerning way they glory in saying that they are down on religion altogether," end quote. Footnote 507 cites the source. In emphasizing the personal aspects of religion, James hopes to avoid this kind of rash and unwarranted dismissal of religion. Furthermore, James believes institutional religion offers a watered-down version of religious experience, whereas private religion is more authentic and informative. Along these lines, he suggests that an examination of individual religious experiences will prove more revelatory and enriching to those investigating the nature of religion than an examination of its institutional elements. Accordingly, he writes, quote, "It would profit us little to study the second-hand religious life, i.e. the products of institutional religion. We must make search rather for the original experiences, which were the pattern setters to all this mass of suggested feeling and imitated conduct." End quote. Footnote 508 cites the source. Proudfoot points out that, quote, "Varieties has been criticized for its individualism and for James's lack of attention to ritual, doctrine, and the social institutional context of religious experiences. Each of these is a function of the deliberately ahistorical character of his inquiry." End quote. Footnote 509 cites the source. Granting that he must limit himself to certain aspects of religion, given his wide-reaching definition of it, I too want to mention some reservations I have regarding James's exclusion of the institutional elements of religion. To begin with, one commonly finds that the way in which a religious individual comes to be religious, i.e. the impetus for his or her individual religious experience, is, for better or worse, significantly affected by institutional and social elements of religion. After all, many, if not most, adults who consider themselves religious were raised going to church services regularly, participated in the social and other events affiliated with the church, and would acknowledge that their perspectives on a number of important issues were shaped by the various church doctrines that they were taught at these services and events. Daniel Dennett echoes my point here, suggesting that one, quote, "could hardly deny that those social and cultural factors hugely affect the content and structure of the individual's experience." End quote. Footnote 510 cites the source. If this is the case, it would seem that one cannot hope to adequately address an individual religion without also touching upon the social and institutional elements that so often inspire it. Proudfoot echoes this point, asking, quote, "How are we able to properly identify and describe an experience of an individual that is reported in a particular text without attention to the specific language and historical and social context of the text and of the event to which it testifies?" End quote. Footnote 511 cites the source. Suffice it to say that partitioning the social and the private elements of religion from one another, as James proposes to do, is not an easy matter. Also, by excluding the institutional element of religion from his investigation, James seems to be ignoring what many take to be an essential ingredient of religion. After all, when we hear the word religion, many of us automatically conjure up images of churches and church doctrines, not to mention temples, synagogues, mosques, shrines, holy sites, etc., just as James himself suggests. Thus, just as there are those who think of religion as entailing belief in a supernatural God, many are naturally inclined to include institutional elements in any discussion of religion. For them, what it means to be religious is implicitly tied to these institutions. Therefore, in proposing, quote, "to ignore the institutional branch entirely," end quote, I would argue James is, in a sense, proposing to ignore what many of us take to be a very integral part of religion. One could then suggest that, in explicitly choosing to ignore the institutional component of religions, what James has to say no longer seems to reflect religion per se, but something more akin to the private spiritual experience of individuals. We ought, once again, to bear these considerations in mind when considering what James says about the utility of religion. Also, both sides of the religious partition affect human beings in significant ways. And contrary to James, I am not limiting myself to a discussion of individual religion. One can't deny, nor does James try to, that religious institutions introduced throughout history have had significant and long-lasting effects on the welfare of human beings. And, where utility of religion is the concern, it seems prudent to consider such effects. I will offer a more extended discussion of this point in Section A of Part 3. So again, that was Section A of Part 2 of Chapter 3, William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.